Story 1. I was talking to my coworker about my recent trip to BJ's, the restaurant, and how much I enjoyed their wings. She thought I was referring to the wholesale store, so I had to explain that I went to the restaurant. The conversation eventually turned to what business people think of first when they hear BJ's. I mistakenly asked an elderly lady checking out, without any context, "What do you think of first when I say BJ's?" I could never live that one down. Story 2. The art teacher at my school typically wears a t-shirt, apron, hair pulled up, headband, and glasses, and sometimes a mask. I saw her at a dressy event and exclaimed, "You look so pretty. I didn't even recognize you." Story 3. I was joking with a coworker when someone poked their head in, and I greeted them by name. We work in a large place, and she exclaimed, "You really know everybody and their family." So I joked back, "Yes, I do. By the way, how is your brother?" She answered, "Still dead. I forgot he had passed away last month." Story 4. I rolled my eyes and said, "Everyone knows women can't drive," in a sarcastic tone. My boss, who thought I was serious, took it as a sign that I was a good Christian girl and wanted to be my boyfriend. Story 5. I was in an indoor playground in Austin with my 2 young daughters, talking to a friend about skiing. I was telling her how my family had property near Taos, but I never went there to ski because most of the slopes were black diamond and beyond my skill level. My younger daughter escaped across the room, and as I chased her down, I called loudly to my friend, "I just don't enjoy going. It's something like 60% black. It's been almost 30 years, and I still wince at the memory." Story 6. I told a family friend that the baby looked like the husband, but I said, "I wouldn't panic yet. He'll probably grow out of it in a few years." I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Story 7. I was getting a massage at an upscale spa where I had to sign a medical waiver. The therapist was reviewing my information and asked how I was feeling and if I had any problems. I responded that I was a little naughty this morning. Unfortunately, she misinterpreted it as me saying I was feeling naughty. She gave me an uncomfortable look. It wasn't until partway into the massage that I realized the misunderstanding. Story 8. My 3-year-old son accidentally sprained my wrist, and I thought it was broken. I was in the emergency room answering questions when the triage nurse asked if I felt safe at home. I jokingly replied, "Not anymore." He looked at me seriously and said, "I'm going to have to report that." Story 9. One time, my friend and I were play fighting. For context, she is Asian and I am not. She said, "At least I don't have an ugly red car." I replied, "Well, at least I have eyes that can see right." She interpreted this as a comment about her having Asian eyes. We live in a town with very few Asians, so she experiences a lot of racism. I was not referring to her eye shape. Earlier that day, while hanging out, we were looking at some shorts at the store. She called them red, but they were maroon, and we had been joking about how she couldn't tell the difference. It was just a joke about colors, not about her eyes, and she didn't mind it. So when I said, "Well, at least I have eyes that can see right," I meant that at least I could see my car was maroon, not red. I didn't think much of it when I said that, but she replied, "Well, at least I grew up in a healthy family." I laughed and continued on my way. We were already joking with each other as we parted. I didn't take offense because I'm not sensitive about that aspect of my life, so I didn't realize anything was wrong. Other people in our friend group gasped, but I thought it was all in good fun. Then I heard her say, after I had taken a few steps away, "Well, if she is going to say something racist to me, I'm going to say something mean back," to the other girls in our group. I immediately ran back and asked, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, racist? What do you mean?" She explained that she thought I was making fun of her Asian eyes and implying that she couldn't see right. I quickly clarified my intention and apologized, saying I should have been more aware of how my words could be interpreted. She felt bad for what she said about my family. We both ended up emotional, but we resolved the situation on the spot. We are still good friends, but I sometimes feel bad for not realizing how my comment sounded. Story 10. I worked at a large chain pet store in college, where we received training on how to spot shoplifters. If we noticed any of the warning signs, there were subtle responses we were taught to use to minimize theft without confrontation. A woman came in about once a week for several weeks, displaying almost every warning sign, wearing a huge winter coat in the summer, slowly walking down aisles while avoiding employees, and never making a purchase. One day, I began greeting her loudly, organizing shelves in her vicinity, and generally keeping an eye on her. She reacted by almost literally running from the store in panic. It turned out she lived in a supervised living community nearby and had severe social anxiety along with some developmental disabilities. Someone from the community accompanied her a few days later to help her feel comfortable in the store, as she loved seeing the animals. They assumed her distress was due to paranoia and social anxiety, rather than employees actually following her around. I still feel guilty about this, and it was over 20 years ago. Story 11. I was at a party, talking to some old acquaintances about games we used to play as children. The Sims came up as a topic, and people were sharing strange things they used to do in the game, like removing the ladder from the pool or setting the kitchen on fire. I never did any of that, but I tried to create neighborhoods where you had at least one child in every family fathered by the mailman, or where you made step-siblings get together. This was well before I discovered adult content or even had any concept of sexuality, so it was more based on jokes I had heard. Anyway, I told the people at the party about this, and they all interpreted it as me having some weird fetishes. I do have some fetishes, but these are not among them. I still feel embarrassed about it. Story 12. Me at the drive-in. They had a new intercom system, and it was so clear. At the window, I said, "You sounded great. I could understand you." She gave me the strangest look. Driving away, I realized I hadn't mentioned that it was the intercom that sounded good. A white woman, had just told a Hispanic woman at the drive-in that I was impressed I could understand her. I was so embarrassed that I wanted to go back and say, "No, no, I meant the intercom," but I thought I would probably look completely crazy, so I just drove away feeling awful. Story 13. In my college creative writing class, I wrote a poem about my boyfriend's trusty pocket knife, intending it in a straightforward manner. However, my classmates interpreted it with deeper meanings and found sadomasochistic symbolism. I am still mortified thinking about it. Story 14. When I was in college at the end of my senior year, I worked a summer job as a server with several older women who had dedicated their careers to serving. I mentioned something about when I would start my real job, and it seriously offended one of the ladies who had been there for years. Story 15. I was getting ready to assistant referee a soccer game. I put some sunscreen on my face but couldn't tell if it was rubbed in. I asked the head referee if my face was white. He was Hispanic. Two players from one of the teams, who happened to be black, were nearby. All three of them looked at me for a moment, wordless. I rephrased my question, "Is my sunscreen rubbed in?" I saw the moment of realization for all three of them. "Yes, you're good," the referee said. Story 16. I used to go to an art supply store to buy items, and there was one employee I often talked to. I guess she must have seen me as a friend. One day, I asked how much some items cost, and she said, "For you, they are free." For the life of me, I don't know why I didn't just say thanks and leave it at that. Instead, I said, "Why me?" Her mood immediately changed. I could tell she was deeply upset. She wrapped the items, put a price tag on them, and forcibly handed them to me. It wasn't even my intention to buy them. I merely asked out of curiosity. I thought she would get over it soon, but I was wrong. About 10 years later, I returned to that same store, and she was still very angry with me. I wish I could take that moment back. I don't even know why I asked, "Why me?" But what I do know is that it wasn't my intention to offend her at all. Story 17. In second grade, we practiced taking dictation. We paired up, and one person spoke while the other wrote down what was said. When it was my turn to write, I asked my partner to pause frequently because I wasn't a very fast writer. I don't remember exactly how I phrased it, but our teacher thought I was asking her not to say much at all to give me less work. She stormed over, grabbed my arm, dragged me into the hall, and shouted at me until I cried. Then she made my partner stay in from recess with me so she could sit and glare at me while I wrote down what she said. For context, the teacher already disliked me. My parents did not believe in attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder, but it certainly believed in me. Story 18. I had just started dating my first husband near the end of the spring semester, and he stayed with some friends I didn't know for a few weeks before going overseas for the summer. When we saw each other again in the fall, we hadn't spoken all summer, and he said, "Why didn't you call me?" It was before cell phones, and the number I had for him was his friend's house. I responded, "I'm not really comfortable calling strangers." He took it as me calling him a stranger, and even now, after a 12-year relationship, 5 years married, a divorce, and 25 more years of friendship, he still claims I called him a stranger. Story 19. The Dutch word for cook is kook. 15 years ago, in a small restaurant in the Italian mountains, we had a splendid meal. The little Sicilian waiter, who was very friendly and had limited English, worked hard to make it a great evening for us, and as mentioned, the meal was absolutely perfect. While paying and giving a tip, I told the waiter to give the coke a kiss for me. When he looked at me in surprise, I repeated, "Please, kiss the coke." My wife was on the floor laughing and framed the words, "Please kiss the coke for me," and it has been hanging in our kitchen to this day. Story 20. I work at an emergency veterinary clinic. One afternoon, we had a cute little dog come in, and she was being held and pampered by the technicians the entire time she was there. The family left to get dinner while we ran some tests, and when they returned, I told them, "She's so sweet. I don't think she's been set down this whole time." The whole family suddenly looked horrified, and one of them exclaimed, "She was put down?" I quickly mimed setting something on the ground and babbled, "No, no, no. She hasn't been set down. She's been held this whole time. She's fine." The rest of our exchange was incredibly awkward, with one of the family members glaring at me for the remainder of their time in the waiting room. I will be forever haunted by this moment, and I will never, ever use the phrase "put down" at work again. Story 21. I thought I was all out of condoms. It was an immediate mood killer, and she left. She assumed that I must be using a lot when, in fact, I meant that I had forgotten. I emptied the condom box and put them in my drawer. Story 22. At dinner when I was around 7 years old, I was talking about how much I disliked our church. I referred to it as Minister's House of Horrors. However, I had a speech impediment, and everyone thought I said, House of Whores. The resulting confusion and distress from my parents led to my discovery of what prostitutes are. Story 23. In university, 2 of my friends started dating. Occasionally, they would kiss, and I would jokingly say, "EW," in response to their public displays of affection. It became a playful tease among friends. However, I realized I had spent so much time with them that my reaction had become instinctive to public displays of affection in general. One day at a gaming convention, I was with a group of new people when I saw 2 women share a quick kiss. I reflexively exclaimed, "Ew," and received some disapproving looks. It dawned on me that people might think I was homophobic. Story 24. I was trying to compliment this girl's outfit. She had a really cool, artsy, vintage look. So I said, "You look like someone who lives in a thrift store." I meant it in a fun, quirky, fashionable way. But as soon as it came out of my mouth, the whole table went quiet. She looked at me as if I'd just insulted her entire family. I panicked. I tried to backtrack, but that didn't help. Story 25. I was at a family party, and the lights were really bright. I attempted to quote the line from the movie Poltergeist. "Go into the light, Carol," and my sister shot me a look because a few weeks before, a relative named Carol and had passed away. Story 26. I was getting a 24-hour heart monitor, and the lady who was putting it on me and walking me through the process mentioned that I should write down any activities like going for a run so they could compile a proper report at the end. I asked her what I should indicate if I was just going home to watch a movie with my husband and relax. I was totally genuine and conversational. She replied that they didn't need to know I was doing that. I could just put exercise. I wondered why I needed to put exercise if I was just sitting on the couch. She looked mortified, and I think we both felt a little embarrassed as she had to explain that she thought I meant Netflix and chill. Story 27. After my divorce, I was looking to find a cute friend with benefits. I matched with a girl and we were vibing. We were messaging one night while I was cooking, and I shared that with her. She said she loves a woman who can cook, and I replied that I enjoy feeding people. She immediately unmatched. It wasn't until I told one of my friends how confused I felt that he suggested she might have thought I meant I had a feeder fetish. I don't. I just really like to take care of people by cooking for them. Story 28. My friend's husband hit on me while she was out of the room. He said he would like to get together with me anytime. I was seriously shaken and speechless. She came back into the living room before I could say anything. I left shortly thereafter and went home, feeling sick. I was trying to figure out what I should do. Should I stop visiting them or tell her? I decided to talk to one of our other friends to get some advice. I explained what happened and said I didn't know what to do. She immediately started yelling at me, saying I was a horrible and disloyal friend. I hadn't had the chance to explain my options. She assumed I was considering his offer. I hung up the phone and we never spoke of it again. I was shocked that she would think I would do that. The couple eventually divorced a few years later. I never told her what he said, and I never spoke to him after that evening. Story 29. I once walked into a sports bar to watch a game on the TV, but since it was hockey, none of the TVs were showing it. I meant to ask the bartender, "When you're not busy, can you change the channel to the hockey game?" What I actually said was, "Since you're not working, put the hockey game on." I don't know why my brain crossed wires like that, but I realized it immediately. I apologized, left a $10 bill on the bar, and walked out. Story 30. My coworker's daughter passed away due to a drug overdose. After discussing her for 15 minutes at work, my coworker offered me a plant for my office. I responded, "Oh no, thank you. I'll just kill it." Quickly left. Story 31. I tried to make a joke where I was sarcastically mocking something that racists say, but I didn't make it clear enough that I was mocking racists and not speaking as one. Everyone just looked at me like, "What did you just say?" I'm autistic, and my brain short-circuited from surprise in that moment. All I could manage to say was something like, Not that. Never mind, sorry." Story 32. I went with a group of coworkers to pick up Chick-fil-A for lunch. The car was full with 5 people in a small hatchback, and I was seated in the driver's side rear seat. We parked at the curbside and waited for our orders while 2 employees were carrying our bags and drinks. Since there was so much, I lowered my window and shouted, without any context, "I can take it in the rear." My coworkers burst out laughing, and the employees looked horrified for a moment after hearing those words from a tiny blonde woman. Once they processed what I meant, they proceeded to hand me the food and drinks while I blushed profusely and hid my face afterward. I became the subject of many jokes until I moved on from that job. Story 33. In my Canadian high school, there was a poster advertising a day dedicated to wearing mukluks, but I mistakenly thought it was for UGG boots and said, "You ugly." The girl I said that to assumed I was racist, and I didn't realize my mistake until about a week later. Story 34. At a professional development workshop, I talked about how my father obtained an education degree but never ended up teaching. While he was student teaching in college, many high school girls had crushes on him. Some even figured out where he lived and tried to invite themselves to parties. This experience discouraged him from pursuing a career as a high school teacher. I can't recall exactly how I phrased it, but I made it sound as if my dad acted inappropriately toward girls and was not permitted to teach anymore. Story 35. At a party in Germany, the hosts are doing a great job of including me, an English-only speaker. I'm having a good time. They ask me how the party is going. I reply that it is not bad. The record scratches, and the room falls silent. I have to explain that not bad means pretty good, realizing that Germans express time differently. For example, 3:30 means half an hour before 3, not half an hour after. I'm not sure they believed me. That was 30 years ago, and I still ponder it. Story 36. My uncle called me 2 days after my mom died. The first thing that came out of my mouth was, "You're kidding." It was shock speaking, and I couldn't help but think, why did you wait 2 days? He screamed back at me, no, I'm not kidding. The rest was a blur. Story 37. One time I told my friend I danced with a guy at a party, but she thought I meant something totally different and told everyone. I was so embarrassed, and it still makes me cringe thinking about it. Story 38. I said you too when the waiter told me to enjoy my meal, and I still think about it as if I ruined both our lives. Story 39. At work in the oil business, I was introduced to a new employee who was a young woman of color wearing a hijab. In our region, it was quite unusual for someone to wear a hijab, and it is likely most people who were born and raised locally had never met a Muslim nor spoken to someone in a hijab. I greeted her, welcomed her to town, shook her hand, and asked, "Where are you from?" She responded, "I'm from America. I'm American." I was so horrified that I disassociated, smiled, nodded, and said, "So nice to meet you," before moving along down the hallway. What I wish I had explained is that I was thinking she was from Texas, probably Houston, because I had heard there were some new hires from that area. Instead, she likely dealt with the 50th person that day who assumed she was an immigrant solely due to the beautiful silk scarf she was wearing. I still cringe when I remember that moment and wish I had clarified my thoughts to her. Story 40. I once tried to tell a boyfriend that he had such a remarkable size that it made everything around it seem small by comparison. However, the way it came out made it sound like I was just telling him he had a minor issue. I still think about that sometimes. Story 41. Years ago, if I had to work late, it would mean walking alone for half a mile in the dark. On those nights, I would go to the hotel where my husband worked as a chef and sit at the bar until he finished his shift. I mainly kept to myself, chatting with the bartenders. Sometimes, guests eating there would engage in conversation with me. I didn't want to say I was the chef's wife because I didn't want to get him in trouble. One night, two intoxicated individuals kept talking to me, and it came up that I was not from the area and had moved for my husband to take a job. I intended to say, we wanted to spread our wings. But instead, I accidentally said, we wanted to spread our legs. These guys did not let it go all night long, and I couldn't even leave. The bartender eventually informed them that my husband was the one preparing their food, so they should chill. Story 42. My first job out of college was an office position, and I was the youngest employee there by 10 years. My team was fantastic, and during the first week, I bonded with one of the girls who helped me with my training. At the end of my first week, while trying to express gratitude for her assistance and care, I said, "You're like my work mom." As soon as it came out of my mouth, I regretted it. She's in her mid-30s, thriving, and a lot of fun, and I'm sure it rubbed her the wrong way because it seemed like I was putting her in the same age category as my mom. She turned her swivel chair away and looked back at her computer. I was so glad it was the weekend, and by Monday everything was fine, but I was mortified after that experience. I definitely learned a lesson there. Story 43. A friend got married, and a large group of people was talking. I assumed that after marriage, the next step is having a child, so I asked her when the baby was coming. She responded, "I'm just overweight." I tried to explain my thought process, but everyone sided with her. Story 44. My boyfriend and I had crabs. We bought a vampire crab enclosure a few years ago, and when we went to my parents' place shortly after, my brother and his girlfriend at the time were discussing what was new with each other. We told them we had recently acquired crabs. My brother's reaction was to tell us we weren't allowed near the furniture. We explained and showed pictures and videos, so everyone understood that we didn't have those kinds of crabs. A few weeks later, we went to Easter dinner. It was my boyfriend, my parents, my brother, and some of his friends. We all decided to play Jackbox afterwards, and one of my mother's answers was, "Fat classy turtles crabs." His friends didn't know we had bought pet crabs. It was pretty awkward, and I'm sure some of them didn't believe we simply had pet crabs and not the other kind. To this day, even though we sold them less than a year after we got them, my brother's now ex-girlfriend still texts me pictures of crabs. It still gets brought up from time to time about our crabs by other family members. My mom thinks it's hilarious that she was telling everyone about our crabs, and my boyfriend, and I think it's funny too. Story 45. My mother's cousin asked me to be a pallbearer at his mother's funeral. She was my grandfather's sister. After the service, we returned to his house, and he thanked me for my participation. Without thinking, I replied, "It was a pleasure," when what I meant to convey was, "It was an honor." He didn't say anything, but I immediately felt horrible, and I still do to this day, 30 years later. Story 46. I was talking to my Japanese friend, and he was telling me about a habit that was unconventional for his culture. He wondered why it wasn't more common, as it made more sense. I told him, maybe because you're an outlier. English is not his native language, and he was just learning. The word outlier was new and somewhat advanced for him. He paused, looked at me, and changed the topic. Being Japanese, he is not known for being direct about his feelings. After that conversation, he became cold toward me, and I had no idea why. It later dawned on me that outlier might have sounded like liar, and he thought I was calling him just that, a liar. To this day, I feel guilty for not explaining it better. Story 47. I told a departing boss not to let the door hit him on the way out. I said it with a smile, trying to lighten an uncomfortable scene. He scowled at me and stomped off. Story 48. As a Category 3 hurricane approached the naval base where I was stationed, I told my roommate, who was unaware of the impending storm, that a storm was coming in a very stoic tone. He thought I was struggling and asked if I was all right. I replied, "No, I'm not going to go off the deep end. A Category 3 hurricane is heading straight for the base. Go to the store and get some extra supplies." Story 49. I created art in 3rd grade that expressed my fear of my mom. It was only after a thorough investigation by school officials and emergency parent conferences, which I was unaware of, that I was finally able to explain that the Halloween drawing was actually about being afraid of mummies. Story 50. When I was working, a comment was made about another nurse calling out sick. Someone mentioned that they heard she was trying to get pregnant. I missed the point that perhaps she was successful and experiencing morning sickness. I thought she stayed home from work for a different reason. I asked, "The whole shift?" I got pregnant after a 12-hour shift and a commute from New Jersey. The other nurses never let me forget that one. Story 51. When I was about 12 years old, I was walking home with my mom when I suddenly saw a large trash container with bags all over the place, as if people had just placed the bags on the side instead of throwing them in the trash. I don't know what came over me, but with an incredibly entitled tone, I said, "I can't believe people are so dirty." Then, from behind the bags, a pair of large, guilty eyes filled with shame locked onto mine. There was a homeless man going through the bags whom I hadn't noticed before. He was bothering no one and minding his own business, and I could see how my comment made him feel. My mom started to reprimand me, and I tried to explain, but she cut me off and we kept walking. I felt terrible for the man. Story 52. I was in 5th grade, and as we were discussing the Underground Railroad, I asked how it was built. I wanted to know how they established contacts, who was safe, and who they could turn to without being betrayed. The teacher responded, "It wasn't a real railroad." At that moment, I lost faith in that teacher and stopped asking questions that year. It was February. Story 53. I was working in a convenience store when a very young-looking Mexican man came in to buy some Swishers. He handed me his ID, and I was surprised to see he was almost 27. I said, "Holy cow, I can't believe you're legal," which is something I have often said to many young-looking people as a sort of backhanded compliment. This was during the first term of the previous administration, during the first immigration and customs enforcement debacle. He did not take it that way, and my sleep-deprived mind did not understand why until about 2 days later. I still wish I could apologize to that man and clarify what I meant. Story 54. It was during a job interview for a role on the Paramount Plus team. The interviewer was describing the team and mentioned how they were into 1990s and early 2000s television shows. I tried to relate it to the Paramount Plus streaming catalog and said, "Oh, like Freaks and Geeks?" She looked serious and gave me a concerned look. I wondered if the show's reputation was problematic since it features James Franco. However, she changed the topic. It was only after the interview that I realized she might not have heard of the show and thought I was calling the people on her team freaks and geeks. Story 55. I have a bit of an Appalachian accent, specifically the Eastern Kentucky version. However, I grew up in Indiana, so my accent stands out. While visiting friends in Indianapolis, we were walking around when one of my friends spotted an unleashed dog sniffing around in someone's yard ahead of us. One of my buddies is a little skittish of dogs, especially bigger ones. He slowed down and asked aloud, "Is that a pit bull up there?" My unthinking response was, "It's a coon dog." Several heads in the neighborhood snapped to attention, including those of my friends. I immediately heard murmurs of, "What did she just say?" Then it hit me. I'm a white woman with a southern accent in the city, and while I was trying to imply, "That's a hound used for hunting raccoons," that is not what everyone in Indianapolis heard. They thought I just said something offensive. My friends believed me when I explained myself, but I was still mortified because there were people nearby who overheard and were openly upset, thinking I was being loudly and unapologetically racist. I still squirm with discomfort, wondering if I ruined someone's good day or hurt them because maybe they heard my initial comment but not my explanation. Story 56. It was my first real job. I was with my supervisor at a client's office, and we were joking around with the receptionist. For some reason, I said, "Haha, yeah, thanks, Obama." For context, I was a very sheltered, naive young adult until I moved out of my Republican household. I thought this was something people said to be funny. I had no idea this was meant as an insult. I liked and voted for Obama. The receptionist's face dropped immediately, and the conversation fell silent. My supervisor and I walked away, and then he quietly told me, "My political views are fine to have, but I should be careful what I say around people." I was so confused and had no idea what he was talking about. It wasn't until years later that I understood what I had done. I never got to set the record straight, and I am still haunted by it today. Story 57. I was around the age of 11 when I told my teenage stepsister, "Maybe I can learn to love him too," about her boyfriend at the time. She gave me a look and basically closed the door in my face. I am autistic and I was just a child. What did she think I was even saying? Story 58. In class and chatting with an older classmate, she discussed how professors at our school are not often available for retakes, as most of them offer only 1 or 2 classes on average. She expressed her wish that they were more accessible and offered more courses, specifically the one that taught the class we were waiting to begin at that moment, which was one of her favorite professors. My big mouth, hoping to convey that I would love to build strong professional connections for recommendations and such, responded, "I know. Come on, professor. I just want a relationship with you." I felt myself dying right there. Instantly, she commented that his wife is gorgeous. Not sure if that was in response to what I said or just a coincidence. Still, I never wanted to crawl into a hole more. Luckily, I think it was just us two in the room, as we were the usual early birds, but I took that moment as a sign to really work on my verbal socialization skills. Story 59. I'll bite. When I was 8, I stayed with an older relative and her son in Nevada. She showed me a video of herself on an amusement park ride simulating the experience of an earthquake. I had never experienced an earthquake as I was from the East Coast, but the ride on VHS looked like a storm. One day, a dust storm came out of nowhere. Apparently, they are common in Nevada, and the wind and rain mixed with sand and lightning looked similar to the ride I saw on the VHS tape. So I exclaimed in my very naive way, "Whoa, this is just like that earthquake ride." My relative didn't hear me say ride. She looked at me and said, "How is this like an earthquake?" Then she turned to her son and, annoyed, sucked her teeth and said, "Stupid." He laughed. I wanted the earth to open up, swallow me, and spit me back home on the East Coast. At that time, I didn't have the words to clarify and say, I was trying to say it was similar to what I saw in the movie. I would get tongue-tied when embarrassed, so I generally clammed up. But I was convinced my relative thought I was stupid from then on. Until then, I thought she was the coolest. It turned out she was another adult who didn't really care about my feelings as a child. That always haunts me because maybe I wouldn't have felt like such a dunce. I think it haunts me because why speak to a child with such harshness? Story 60. I worked in a shop where we had a visiting manager and other staff for a day, and I answered a phone call. The caller wanted to speak to her and asked for her by name. Unsure of her name, I looked for a distinguishing feature to identify the right person. She had very dark hair, so I said, "Oh, yes. Is that the lady with dark hair? I'll put her on." I was genuinely thinking of her hair color. She also happened to be black. I still cringe when I reflect on that moment and am unsure of what I should have said instead. She was the only black staff member. Story 61. My sister texted that our grandma was talking about jumping off the roof. As she has dementia, I replied with, "I'd like to see her jump." But I meant it sarcastically, as in I'd love to see her even attempt to jump. She is very old and frail and would definitely not be jumping anywhere. However, my sister thought I seriously meant I wanted her to jump. I didn't realize the miscommunication until weeks later when she said, "That was messed up. I had to explain myself." Story 62. I taught 12th grade at a preparatory school in the Deep South. I was at the end of my first year teaching as a young, naive 21-year-old who made nearly every mistake in the book but, thankfully, was also good at what I did. And so, for the cherry on top of that year, the principal announced the results of the student body election over the school-wide speakers, culminating with the student body president. I, being foolish, said, "Well, there goes the neighborhood." For absolutely no reason except that it just popped into my head. Yes, dear reader, you can probably already guess what I did not know. The newly elected president was black in an overwhelmingly white school. Did I mention it was in the Deep South? I have to mention it again. There were a few gasps which I attributed to my wit. I had then largely forgotten about it until, in fifth period, a sweet girl came up to me before class and said, "I'm guessing since it's you that you don't know who the new president is, right?" All the air seemed to be sucked out of the room when I learned this important detail. I honestly thought I'd pass out. She said, "Don't worry. Everyone knows you didn't know, but you should really think before you speak." I have been haunted by that for nearly 25 years. Story 63. Not something I said, more something I did. I was probably in kindergarten at the time and had been practicing making funny faces. One particular night, I was really into pulling the skin near my eyes back from the temple area. My parents had friends over for dinner, friends who happened to be Asian. After they left, my dad asked me if I was trying to make fun of them. I was mortified. It never crossed my mind. But to this day, I cringe at the thought of seeming like a racist to these people who were just over for a visit. A memory my mind likes to bring up as I'm trying to fall asleep. Story 64. I was a sleep-deprived mom with a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. I told a neighbor that I couldn't wait to watch a movie for adults that night. Her face shifted to a look of horror. It took me a few seconds to realize why. I had to explain that I just wanted to watch something intended for adults instead of a cartoon for preschoolers. Story 65. I made a comment in the subreddit No Stupid Questions about individuals who shoot at gay pride parades, only to be discovered as gay themselves when the police searched their laptops. Somehow, everyone thought I was calling gay people Nazis, to the extent that I was permanently banned from the subreddit. When I appealed the ban and tried to explain my actual intent, they muted me for 28 days. After that, when I appealed again, they muted me for another month. Only on my third attempt did they bother to listen, and this was the resulting conversation. I'm still banned. Story 66. I was admitted to the hospital for surgery. I met with the intake nurse to complete the paperwork. She was very kind and assured me that if I had any questions, I should ask her, even if I felt embarrassed. I was quite nervous about having surgery, and I didn't want to share a room with a man, but I struggled to find the right way to express my concern. What came out of my mouth was, "Are the hospital rooms segregated?" The horrified look on the nurse's face before I could regroup and clarify. "I mean by gender. I don't feel comfortable sharing a room with a man." Still makes me cringe when I remember it. Story 67. I had a drink with my mom and sister at Disneyland. I was feeling buzzed, and my mom told me I needed to finish my drink before we went on Goofy Sky School. I replied, "Sorry, I'm still working on it." My mom and sister stopped in their tracks and turned around, speechless. Then they burst into laughter. They still tease me about it, and it happened years ago. Story 68. 8th grade afternoon following a big sleepover with friends. I was walking in town when I passed a friend with her mom. Her mom asked if we had fun. I replied, "Yeah, but I bet you were ready for quiet again." We were total horrors. I laughed until I saw her wide eyes. "Can you guess what she thought?" I said. "I bet you can." Story 69. I might start tweaking out just by typing this. I have a neck and shoulder twitch brought on by medication I had to take as a teenager. This is important to know. Some classmates and I were chatting in math class. We were talking about neurodivergent people in our families and what it's like for us, including my cousin and their siblings. Another girl chimed in and asked, "What are you all talking about?" I turned and said, "Oh, we're talking about people that are..." I twitched, kinked my neck to the side, and my shoulders shot up while my arm loosely crossed my body in a pretty offensive way. My classmates and the girl looked at me in absolute shock. "Why would you do that? That's so offensive." I was flooded with embarrassment. My face felt hot. I tried to explain what had just happened and that it wasn't on purpose. They all stopped talking and just went back to their work. The fact that I didn't go off the grid that day out of shame is something I still pride myself on. But man, that sucked. Story 70. My husband was talking to me while I was drinking. I accidentally exclaimed, "Hang on. I'm busy trying to suck all the balls." I was referring to the boba pearls in my drink. I think my husband was on the floor and couldn't breathe from all the laughing. Story 71. My siblings and I were walking behind our grandmother in a row because that's what children do when they follow an adult. I thought it was really cute how much we all loved her. So I said, "Grandma, do you ever feel like a mother duck sometimes?" Because we looked like a bunch of ducklings trailing devotedly behind their mom. That woman whipped around as if she had been slapped into a spin, glared at me and shouted, "Why would you say that?" "Because I waddle when I walk." She took my dumbfounded expression to be one of guilt rather than surprise, which only reinforced her belief that I had called her a fat, waddling person. There was no opportunity to explain my true intent, no matter how hard I tried. Anything I said was deemed a fumbling excuse because I sounded panicked, and nobody thinks like that. So, I had to endure her berating me for saying something so horrible. She pointed out all the ways she had been kind, loving, and forgiving to me and portrayed me as a callous person who didn't care about her or anyone else's feelings. As an adult, I can recognize that her reaction was completely inappropriate. As a child with abusive parents who saw their grandmother as their real mom, it shattered me. I was so vulnerable and open to the love I felt for her when I implied she was a mother duck. It was a risk because I knew she could be unpredictable, but it felt worthwhile because I believed she loved me enough to understand and appreciate what I said. Clearly, I was mistaken. She told everyone who would listen about what I had said afterward. My parents used it to confirm that I was a bad person. It was brought up to shame me for years before becoming a funny story she shared to embarrass me, even as an adult. I didn't say another intentionally sentimental thing to her or anyone else until I was well into adulthood, had children of my own, and hadn't spoken to my family for several years. However, I still do my best to be very careful with what I say to people so they can't turn it around and attack me for it, even when it's meant to be kind. Story 72. I was talking to my mother-in-law about our language barriers, and we have been experiencing some recent tension. She seemed to avoid conversation, so I mentioned, "Please don't be afraid to talk to me." She snapped her head at me with a confused look on her face and quickly responded, saying she isn't afraid of me, asking, "Why would I be afraid?" I had to explain that it's just an expression, not actual fear, but for some reason, she wasn't convinced. It was a strange interaction. However, I expressed my appreciation for her and left it on a positive note. This type of interaction has occurred a few times during this period, leading me to wonder if she might be doing it on purpose. Nonetheless, I try my best to maintain peace out of respect for my wife. Story 73. I was in a badminton club at university, and we were looking for a fourth person to complete our doubles game. A random guy volunteered, and I declared, "We have a winner." I didn't think much about the fact that he never showed up again or that I said winner in a highly affected way, like wiener. It wasn't until years later that someone pointed out the connection between the two. Story 74. I used to work in the penguin exhibit at my city's aquarium. The aquarium has two species of penguins, African penguins and northern rockhopper penguins. The penguins differ notably in personality. In general, the rockhoppers are friendly and love to cuddle, while the African penguins can bite if provoked, which is quite easy to do. I was discussing my experience with the penguins in public when someone walked by just as I, a white South African, said loudly, "Yeah, those African penguins are quite vicious." I was referring to the penguins, but if looks could kill. Story 75. I didn't actually say anything, but what I did was horrible. Acquaintances announced their engagement, and of course we wanted to admire the ring. So I grabbed her left hand, saw the ring, immediately dropped her hand, and grabbed her other hand because I thought I had grabbed the wrong one, but there was no ring on the other hand. I immediately thought to myself, "You're so foolish." I didn't know how to recover, so I just walked away as someone else praised her small, non-traditional engagement ring. Story 76. When I was 17 and still a virgin, I worked in a supermarket at the counter where they sold tobacco and other items. We also sold condoms at that counter, but I had never sold any before. One day, a young man just a few years older than me came up to the counter and asked for condoms. We sold them in a small box of 3 and a bigger box of 12, so without thinking, I asked him if he wanted the small one. He looked at me strangely and quickly said, "No, big." In my native language, the small sounds the same when referring to one item or multiple, so I didn't realize that while I intended to ask if he wanted the small box, he probably interpreted it as me asking if he wanted small condoms. I was so embarrassed. Story 77. I supported a teacher in our kindergarten classroom. I wouldn't call us friends, but we were able to exist around each other. We just never really connected. She had mentioned to me once that she doesn't like having her photo taken. One day, a medium-sized group of staff was taking a photo in our pink shirts. My teacher was walking by, and someone suggested she should join. I remarked that her shirt wasn't pink enough with a big, genuine smile on my face. She stared at me blankly and kept walking. My words just came out wrong, and I wanted to explain, but I never found the moment. It felt noticeably colder for the rest of the year. To make matters worse, we were not the same race, and I always worried that she interpreted my words in a whole new way, as something exclusionary. I cringe whenever I think of it because I realized what it must have looked like when I was truly just trying to give her an out for the photo. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.